In traditional SMP content, the goal is almost always to acquire power. In an SMP of 20 to 30 people, this is relatively simple. Ally yourself with skilled PvPers, get more resources than the opposition, use lies and deception. Unstable Universe, or UU, however, is not a traditional SMP. First, it's staged, so it's not really a simulation of the actions of individuals, but rather deliberate choices made by the writers. And second, it's more accurately described as an MMORPG or a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, since it has thousands of players in its world building. This means that acquiring and maintaining power in UU is much more reminiscent of the methods authoritarian dictators use to acquire and maintain power in the real world. The Invis Mafia, led by UU Ashswag, will be the main case study for this video since he represents the most breadth of power anyone has been seen to achieve in Unstable Universe. To be clear, all references to Ashswag in this video will be to his character. UU exhibits a lot of strategies real dictators use to come into power, and to do a bit of speculation into the creative process, I believe this is intentional since we know CC Parrot is a huge fan of the Hunger Games, which is also a criticism of authoritarian government, I think, which is particularly relevant in modern times. Notably, however, we don't actually know that much about Ash's rise, so this video will mostly cover his rule and fall. Also, we will primarily cover what's in Parrot's POV, since that's what I remember most, and frankly, UU Season 1 is a bit too long to rewatch at this point in the year, so if you have anything to add from Spoke or Wembu's POV, feel free to share with the class. The primary gimmick of the Invis Mafia is the interstasis, where the Mafia holds the members' pearls hostage and teleports anyone who resists the Mafia into the void at will. The threat of death keeps people from trying to throw a coup out of fear of their own and other safety, and also keeps the higher level diamond players loyal to Ash, who can then execute on Ash's orders to purge anyone they want. This kind of tactic is broadly described as force or coercion and obviously isn't a particularly realistic measure. IRL, the diamond players are akin to secret police such as the NKVD from the Soviet Union or the Daily from Ba Sing Se, for a more cultural relevant example, though that's also fictional. And these are generally maintained through other execution methods and paying them money. This is also the case in UU, as high-tier PvPers are provided with the best gear and resources such as maces and status, which reflects motivations that might be seen more in the real world. There's also, of course, the case of political power and rules. Even if these are social constructs and don't represent any physical force, most humans are obliged to go with the flow in these regards to stay out of conflict. In the Soviet Union, Stalin had the position of general secretary, which allowed him to slowly replace all the major figures in the government legally without using much force during his rise to power. Though, of course, later he relied heavily on purges of party members too, because he was paranoid. I believe Ash inherited the Mafia from someone, so in theory he wielded political power during his rise and now during his rule as an authoritarian dictator as well. Execution is dandy, but there's also other ways to generate fear. Exile, imprisonment, torture, arrest, threatening your family, labor camps, etc. For Ash, the most prominent example is Mining City, which involves forced labor more to crush the spirit of the people than to be productive economically. The textbook example would be like the Soviet Union's gulags, though of course the conditions and mental effects of these labor camps can't really be effectively portrayed in a YouTube series whose target audience is ultimately children. The Mafia also used blackmailing on Wemmbu by holding Egg hostage. At the peak of the Mafia's power, it didn't really need the Interpearl's threat to maintain its rule. The organization had gotten so large and bloated that it was impossible to keep track of everyone, yet many people such as Watto and Ken went invis and followed orders to blend in and stay safe, ultimately showing the effectiveness of force and fear. And aside from coercion, there is a factor of persuasion as well, making people accept the rule of the authoritarian leader. The main one with the Invis Mafia is the invisibility itself. It makes it so that everyone has a shared identity which is tied to the government, and the only differentiation comes from the colors of the trim, which is also dictated by the government. It keeps people from having personality and getting to know each other, and the reverse can be seen in the dissenters such as Watto, who has a turtle helmet that helps Parrot find him, and Parrot's own spyglass, which he uses as a signal for communication. This means that all aspects of life are dominated by the Mafia, creating a sense of surveillance, much like Big Brother is watching you propaganda. This effect is of course further amplified through the Mafia's policy of sign writing, which makes communication clunky and easier to monitor and surveil. In the real world, persuasion is best achieved through nationalizing institutions to create a command economy where the state dictates who gets control of what resources, which is also why communist regimes, which inherently involve state control of the economy, tend to be more totalitarian than fascist regimes. The Mafia mimics this as they also have control over the vast majority of the resources on the server, such as diamonds as seen in Capital City, the maces, which they obtain control over by removing the means of production or the trial chamber vaults, and the fact that they decide what gear each rank in the Mafia gets. Obviously, Invis mechanisms don't exist in real life, so authoritarian regimes use other methods of surveillance, such as planting mics and cameras and pressuring civilians to act as extensions of the government, reporting anything they are suspicious of. They also do everything in their power to destroy civil society, which are groups that exist separate from the government where people can find unity, such as by nationalizing schools, unions, and religious institutions that are allowed to exist, amplifying the overwhelming presence of the government in people's lives. Additionally, authoritarian governments capitalize on foreign conflict and nationalism using propaganda to maintain unity in line with the government. For there is nothing that brings people together as well as the enemy of my enemy being my friend. For UU, this would be the ceaseless conquest of all the different civilizations on the server, from Sky to the End to the Far Lands, which unites the people serving in the combat forces and instills pride in the civilians who don't. The obvious example for the Soviet Union was World War II and then later Cold War, though interestingly the conflict had drained the USSR of its resources and the last leader had called back a large portion of its military to save on costs, and what ultimately caused the collapse of the USSR was a military coup. China also used this strat by criticizing the US and USSR, stirring up conflict in Taiwan Straits to lift up the international standing of the PRC, but also to garner domestic support for policies like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. Castro's rule in Cuba thrived because of foreign conflict. Castro had come into power by capitalizing on the anti-American sentiments of large parts of the population who were subject to a pro-American military dictator, and he sustained his power by capitalizing on America's Bay of Pigs invasion and Cuban Missile Crisis, using American hostility to justify his rule. He also sent Cuban troops to communist revolutions in other parts of the world like Angola, victories which created more support for the government. And the last way authoritarian leaders can gain power is by actually governing effectively, since ultimately people only want two things from their government: good economic conditions and social freedom. Freedom is obviously not happening in an authoritarian government, but if a government can actually provide for its people, then a large portion of its population, particularly undereducated peasants, would continue to support the government. This is also why student revolutions are so common. In UU, if the Mafia had nothing else, it had a wealth of resources, almost anything the people could possibly want. In theory, it also protected the people in its population centers, providing safety and security, which is also a thing people are big fans of. The USSR was exactly the opposite. Collectivization meant the country could not produce enough to support its population, meaning it relied heavily on government subsidies to lower costs of goods, which would run out eventually. Aforementioned military conflicts all around the globe and in the space race and arms race R&D further exacerbated the situation, meaning that people simply did not want to be ruled by the USSR, leading to dissent. China's time under Mao Zedong was likewise plagued with famine and poor economic conditions for its people, in part because of Mao's insistence on having an independent economy. Only after Mao's death did China really open relations with the rest of the world to establish trade, eventually leading to its economic prowess today that has its people overlooking their lack of freedom, even as China remains a one-party state. The situation in Czechoslovakia more closely mimics that of UU. For the Eastern Bloc, Czechoslovakia had been relatively prosperous, even with a good number of households having television. Yet dissent bubbled up over other issues like human rights and environmental policy, similar to how the people in the Mafia simply no longer wanted to put up with its terror. Thus, authoritarian governments can use terror and manipulation to gain power, but ultimately, if they don't provide people with material resources or decent freedoms, there will be dissent. However, dissent from the population alone cannot overthrow the government because they still possess force in the form of secret police and military, which is exemplified by how the main characters keep running into and getting defeated by the Mafia's combative forces. IRL, this would be reflected in situations like the Hungarian Revolution, which was put down by the USSR military. Ultimately, what people need to break free from authoritarian governance is communication. Knowing that you are not alone in the face of overwhelming presence of the government, seeing someone else speak up first, and being able to coordinate resistance. I think the most inspirational example I've heard of is Poland, in which one of their cardinals became Pope John Paul II. His visit to Poland showed the people that there is still a civil society outside of the government in the form of religion, and also served as an opportunity for people to practice self-organization, paving the way for solidarity, an independent workers' union, which was able to change policy through organizing nationwide strikes. Some historians also credit Solidarity as setting off the chain of events that ultimately led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And for you, this was the beacons. Frankly, nothing explains it better than the video itself. Okay, and honestly, the message of Parrot you use pretty clear. Hope and sharing that hope with others could overcome terror. I hope this video was able to add some context to that and bring to light some of Parrot's writing. Yay, thanks, peace, ciao.